Chapter 3. Points of Departure. Multiplaned reality. Our physical plane, a concept synonymous with what astronomy calls the universe, is characterized, as we know, by three-dimensional space and one time stream. In the terminology of the rose of the world, the physical plane is called Enraf. In modern science and philosophy, debate continues about the infinity or finiteness of Enraf in time and space, and whether the whole universe is contained within Enraf, whether all forms of being are exhausted by its forms. The discovery of antimatter, the appearance and even extraction of physically material particles from out of a physical vacuum, particles that had hitherto existed in the world of negative energy. The experimental corroboration of the theory that the physical vacuum of space in Enraf is awash with oceans of particles of a different materiality. All these facts are signposts on the route that plodding science is following, away from the ideas of classical materialism toward those that differ greatly both from them and from the views of the old idealistic philosophy. It is highly probable that the proponents of the philosophy of materialism have made of the issue by claiming that all its opponents are merely rehashing the old arguments of idealism is one of the tactics in the last stand of the materialistic consciousness before it steps on the brakes, as they say, abandoning one position after another, and at the same time reassuring all that the classic thinkers of materialism had foreseen and long affirmed those very same things. It will be particularly interesting to see what acrobatics philosophy will have to resort to in the near future, when it is forced by the weight of evidence to incorporate antimatter into its system. The primacy of matter over consciousness, the knowability and principle of the entire universe, and at the same time, its infinite and eternal nature. These naive doctrines of materialism, which were conceived during past stages of science, are still regarded as current owing only to contrived manipulations and, more important, to the intervention of authorities that are associated not so much with philosophy as with the police state. On the other hand, many doctrines of traditional religion will not bear up under the scrutiny of modern science to the same degree. The new methods of knowledge, metahistorical and transphysical, will not intrude on fields of scientific knowledge or in any way contradict science in its essentials. At the same time, they will anticipate science's answers to certain questions. A conception of the universe as multiplaned lies at the heart of the rose of the world's worldview. By plane is meant a material world whose materiality differs from that of other planes by virtue of the number of its dimensions and time streams. For example, there are interconnected planes neighboring ours, planes in which space has the same three dimensions, but time has not one stream, as on our plane, but several. That means that on such planes, time flows as several parallel streams of differing speed. On such a plane, events take place simultaneously in all its time streams, but their locus is situated in only one or two of them. It is not easy, of course, to visualize what this means. The inhabitants of such a plane, although they act predominantly in one or two time streams, exist in and are aware of them all. The synchronicity of their being wakens them to the fullness of life to a degree unknown to us. At the risk of getting slightly ahead of myself, I will add that a large number of time streams in combination with a minimal number, one or two of dimensions, has the opposite effect, causing the inhabitants of such planes suffering. This suffering resembles an awareness of one's limitations, a searing feeling of powerless spite, a constant reminder of the enticing opportunities one is not in the position to take advantage of. Some of us would call it being so close yet so far, or recognize it as the torment of Tantalus. With a few exceptions, such as Enroth, the number of time streams on a plane far exceeds the number of dimensions. If I remember correctly, there are no planes in Shadanakar with more than 6 dimensions. As for the number of time streams on the highest of the planes in the Brahmatura, it rises to an astronomical height of 236. In extrapolating the specific features of Enroth onto other planes, it would be a mistake to think that all partitions separating plane from plane must be as difficult to pass through as the partitions separating Enroth from planes of different dimensions. True, there are partitions surrounding some planes that are even more difficult to pass through and that block them off from others even more securely. But such planes are few. There are far more groups of planes in which movement from plane to plane does not require death or a difficult material transformation, as with us, but only the attainment of special inner states. There are also those from which movement to neighboring planes requires no more effort than, say, travel from one country of terrestrial Enroth to another. Several of those planes together form a system. I am accustomed to using the Indian term sakwala when referring to each of those systems of planes or series of worlds. Along with sakwalas, however, there also exist solitary planes like Enroth. Planes and entire sakwalas also differ from each other in the amount of space they occupy. Not all of them encompass the same cosmic area Enroth does. Difficult as it is to imagine, many of them do not extend beyond the limits of our solar system. Others are even more localized. They are immured, as it were, within the confines of our planet. There are even several that are linked not to the planet as a whole, but to only one of its physical strata or regions. There is obviously nothing on those planes that can be likened to the sky. Bound together by shared metahistorical processes, the majority having 2 rival spiritual poles, as it were, all the planes of every heavenly body together form a gigantic, tightly integrated system. I have already mentioned that such systems are called Brahmaturas. In some of them, the total number of planes does not exceed single digits, while in others, it numbers several hundred. Besides Shadanakar, where the total number of planes now stands at 242, Brahmaturas of the Sun, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, the Moon, and certain moons orbiting the larger planets exist at present in the solar system. The Brahmatura of Venus is in the embryonic stage. The remaining planets and moons are as lifeless on their other planes as they are in Enroth. They are either the ruins of former Brahmaturas that were abandoned by all their monads, or else they have never been Brahmaturas. Multiplaned systems of materiality, somewhat analogous to Brahmaturas, but incomparably larger, encompass certain solar systems. For example, the majority of the stars of Orion, or the system of Antares' double suns and its many planets. Even larger are the galactic systems and the system of the entire universe. They are macro-Brahmaturas. There are macro-Brahmaturas known to have an enormous number of variomaterial planes, up to 8,000. There is nothing in the macro-Brahmaturas that can be likened to so-called vacuum, areas of extreme material paucity in Enroth. It is easy to see that macro-Brahmaturas are beyond the comprehension of even the greatest of the great human souls that now dwell in Enroth. No one can directly glean any concrete information about them, except in the form of distant presentiments. Such information sometimes comes to us from the higher spirits of Shadanakar, those immeasurably greater than us, through the medium of the invisible friends of our heart. But even these accounts are extremely difficult for us to comprehend. Thus, it was nearly impossible for me to understand the strange and sorrowful communication that there is in the macro-Brahmatura of our galaxy a material plane where space exists, but time does not, a kind of hole in time, where movement is yet possible. It is the plane of torment of great demons, the realm of eternal darkness. But it is eternal not in the sense of endlessly flowing time, but in the sense of the absence of any time. I would like to point out in passing that the difference between these two senses of the word eternity has thus far barely been grasped in our philosophical thought. That eternity is not absolute, as time can arise there. And therein lies one of the tasks of the grand cycles of cosmic evolution. For only the emergence of time will make it possible to liberate the great sufferers imprisoned in their galactic hell. Molecules and some types of atoms form microbrahmphaturas, minute systems whose existence in our time is sometimes exceedingly brief. They are, however, quite complex worlds, and one should be aware of the fact that elementary particles are living beings, some of whom possess free will and intelligence. But it is practically impossible to communicate with them, let alone personally enter microbrahmphaturas directly. There is no being in any of the planes of Shada who is capable of that at the present time. It surpasses for now even the power of the planetary logos. Only in the macrobrahmphaturas of the galaxy are there spirits of such unimaginable power and grandeur that they are capable of descending simultaneously into multitudes of microbrahmphaturas. To do so, such a spirit must, while maintaining its oneness, incarnate simultaneously in millions of those minuscule worlds, revealing itself in all its fullness in each one of them, and within the tiniest fractions of time. I have, in one way or another, been talking exclusively about material planes, since spiritual planes as such do not exist. The difference between matter and spirit is more a question of degree than of kind. Although spirit is created by God alone and emanates from Him, while monads create materiality. In its initial state, free of any coding we could call material, spirit takes the form of a substance that we could roughly, and only as a first approximation, compare to the subtlest of energy. Only God and monads are the spirit monads, being the countless hosts of God-born and God-created higher selves, indivisible spiritual entities. They differ from each other in the degree of their inborn potential, the inexhaustible variety of their material codings, and the paths their lives take. A monad that has ascended to great heights can be here, there, at many points of the universe at once. But it is not omnipresent. Only the divine spirit is truly omnipresent. It abides even where there are no monads. For example, in those ruins of Brahmphaturas abandoned by all monads. Nothing can exist without him, not even matter we call dead. If the divine spirit left it, it would cease to be, not in the sense of a transformation into another form of matter or energy, but absolutely. The origin of evil, planetary laws, karma. If we examine the myth of the rebellion and fall of Lucifer within the context of the spiritual history of Shadanakar, it fails to shed light on anything. Never in the meta-history of our planet have any events taken place that could be said to have been mirrored in that myth. Something else did take place once, a long time ago, and recollections of it, though distorted, have been preserved in certain other myths, for example, in the legend of the revolt of the Titans. That will be discussed in more detail, however, in regard to something else. As for the legend of the rebellion and fall of Lucifer, those events took place at one time on an ecumenical scale, on the level of that macrobrahmaphatura that encompasses the universe, a level that surpasses all categories of our reason. What happened was translated by the seers of olden times into narrow human concepts specific to their era and took shape as the myth. Those time-specific conceptions have become outdated as the scope of our knowledge has broadened immeasurably. And if we now wish to discern the eternal and true seed of the idea within the myth, we must disregard all the time-specific features introduced into it and focus only on the one central fact affirmed by it. Shatanakar, the proper name of the Brahmavatura of our planet. It comprises a huge, more than 240 number of variomaterial planes of varying dimensions and time streams. Brahmavatura. Almost every heavenly body possesses a number of variomaterial planes that together form a closely integrated system. These systems, united by the commonality of processes taking place on their planes, are called Brahmavaturas. In the majority of Brahmavaturas in our galaxy, the chief process uniting the planes of each is the struggle between the providential and the demonic forces. There are, however, Brahmavaturas that have completely fallen under the sway of the demonic and those that have freed themselves entirely of it. Demons. The higher humankind of Shatanakar, who abide in a sakwala of four-dimensional worlds with differing numbers of time streams. Demons proceed along a path of growth similar to ours, but they began much earlier and are completing it with greater success. They are linked to our humanity by a variety of threads, some of which are described in the main text. Sakwala. Here it means a system of two or more variomaterial planes closely connected in structure and metahistory. Metahistory. The sum of processes, as yet outside the field of vision and methodology of science, that take place on planes of variobeing existing in other time streams and dimensions, and that are sometimes visible through the process we perceive as history, and the religious teaching about those processes. It was only natural that the knowledge even the wisest of those times possessed concerning the magnitude and structure of the universe lagged so far behind contemporary knowledge that the ecumenical information that filtered into their minds through the efforts of the invisible friends of their heart was flattened and compressed into the narrow confines of their empirical experience, of their powerful, but as yet unenlightened and unsubtle, minds. On the other hand, the task of anyone who attempts nowadays to convey in human words and concepts even an echo of the ecumenical mystery of the rebellion of the so-called morning star could hardly be much easier. Such an attempt would consist of two stages. First, a search in the ocean of our concepts for words and phrases that mirror better than others that fantastic reality. Second, a search in the ocean of our language for words and phrases that are capable of even slightly mirroring, in turn, those elusive concepts. But the success of such an undertaking is dependent on a person's inner growth and on his or her ecumenical insight. It cannot be accomplished on a whim. I feel myself capable of only the beginning stages of such a work. I therefore cannot state anything concerning ecumenical events of that nature except to give simple confirmation of an event that at one time occurred. Back in the forgotten depths of time, a spirit, one of the greatest, whom we call Lucifer or Satan, in exercising his free will, which is the inalienable attribute of every monad, rejected its creator in order to create another universe according to its own plan. He was joined by a host of other monads, both great and small. They began to create another universe within the confines of this one. They tried to create worlds, but those worlds proved unstable and collapsed because, in rebelling, the monads that turned from God in so doing also renounced love, the single unifying, bonding principle. Monad. Here the term means a primal, indivisible, immortal spiritual entity which can be either God-created or God-born. The universe is composed of a countless number of monads and of the numerous kinds of materiality created by them. The ecumenical plan of providence leads a great many monads up to a higher oneness. As they ascend the steps of being, the forms of their unions evolve. Love for God and for each other bring them closer and closer together. When each of them immerses itself in the universal Sun and co-creates with Him, the most perfect of unions takes place. Merger with God without the loss of one's unique self. The ecumenical design of Lucifer is exactly the opposite. Each of the monads that allied themselves with Lucifer is but a temporary ally and a potential victim. Every demonic monad, from the greatest to the lowest, clings to the dream of becoming the ruler of the universe. Pride prompts it to think that it is the one with the potential to be the strongest of all. It is ruled in its actions by a kind of categorical imperative, which can to a certain extent be reduced to the formula, there is I and not I. All not I must become I. In other words, everything and everyone must be swallowed up by that single, absolutely self-asserting self. God gives of Himself. The powers that rejected God try to absorb everything into themselves. That is why they are first and foremost vampires and tyrants, and that is why a tyrannical tendency is not only inherent in any demonic self, but is one of its essential attributes. Therefore, demonic monads temporarily join forces, but deep down, they are rivals to the death. That antagonism surfaces when some limited power is seized by their group. A free-for-all then begins, and the strongest triumphs. The hopelessness of the demon's cosmic struggle also springs from the fact that God is always creating more and more monads, and, since the demons are incapable of creating even one, the balance of power is constantly shifting against them. There are not, nor will there ever again be any more falls. That is absolutely guaranteed, and I deeply regret that the extreme complexity of the question prevents me from finding the concepts necessary to present it in some kind of intelligible manner. In any case, all the demonic monads are of very ancient origin. They are all veterans of that great rebellion. True, something like a fall, but in fact, different has taken place since and takes place now. A highly conscious being, sometimes even a whole group of them, temporarily chooses to oppose providential will. That choice against God is not made by the monad itself, but by the lower self, by a limited mind. For that reason, its rejection of God takes place not in the spiritual world, but in the material worlds, which are subject, by the will of those same demons, to the law of retribution. The mutiny is thus doomed to failure, and the mutineer embarks on a long road of atonement. Gradually, in the course of their struggle, the futility of trying to create their own universe became apparent to the demonic forces. So while continuing to create individual worlds and expending incredible amounts of energy to stabilize them, those forces set themselves another goal: to take over worlds already in existence or in the process of being created by the providential powers. Their goal is the takeover, not the destruction, of those worlds. But destruction is the objective end result. Bereft of the bonding principles of love and co-creation, held together only by the conflicting principle of coercion, such worlds cannot exist for any extended period of time. There are galaxies in the process of disintegration even now. And when astronomy begins to observe intergalactic nebulae over a longer period of time than it does now, the process of those galactic catastrophes will be revealed to science. There are planets either dead or dying. Mars, Mercury, Pluto, the ruins of Brahmaphuturas, All the monads of light were driven from those systems which had fallen under demonic rule, after which a final catastrophe ensued. And the demon legions were left to roam homeless in space, seeking a new Brahmapatra to invade. On the other hand, there are macro-Brahmapatras and whole galaxies where the legions of the rebel have been unable to force a breach. Orion, a macro-Brahmapatra of extraordinary spiritual light, is a solar system within our galaxy that has entirely freed itself of the demonic. Those who gaze through a telescope at the great nebula of Andromeda will see with their own eyes a galaxy that has never been invaded by demons. It is a world that from start to finish has been ascending steps of ever-increasing bliss. There are many such worlds among the millions of galaxies in the universe. But our galaxy, unfortunately, is not one of them. Long ago expelled from the macro-Brahmapatra of the universe, the forces of the rebels are waging a continuous, relentless war against the forces of light in the worlds of our galaxy. This war has taken millions of forms. Shadanakar also came to be a war front. Shadanakar became a front far back in those distant times, when the Earth was no more than a semi-molten globe in Enroth, while other planes in Shadanakar, as yet numbering in the single digits, had only just been created by the great hierarchies of macro-Brahmapatras. There was no law of survival on those planes. There, in the worlds of those beings now known to us by the generic term angels, the principles of love and friendship between all ruled. There was no law of death. Everyone moved from plane to plane by means of a painless material transformation that did not rule out the possibility of returning. In those worlds, which at the time had only 3 dimensions and were consequently almost as dense as Enroth, there was no law of retribution. Mistakes were rectified with the help of the higher powers. A glimmer of recollections of that time, floating up into the consciousness of ancient sages from their treasury of deep memory, but vulgarized and simplified by that consciousness, became crystallized in the legend of Paradise Lost. In reality, it was not paradise, but a gorgeous dawn rising not over terrestrial Enroth, which back then was devoid of organic life, but over the world that is now called Olirna. The dawn glowed and was preserved in the memories of those few human monads who did not, like most, come later to Shadanakar, but who began their journey in times before the distant past, and not in Enroth, but in angelic Olirna. That community of proto-angels can be called, in a certain sense, the first humankind of Shadanakar. Enroth, the name of our physical plane, a concept synonymous with what astronomy calls the universe. It is characterized by 3 dimensions of space and 1 time stream. Olirna, the first of the worlds of ascent, the land of the dead common to all humanity, although the landscape varies between metacultures. Metaculture, the inner sakwalas of Shadanakar, which take the form of multiplaned segments, as it were. Metacultures are composed of varying numbers of planes, but each has at least 3 specific planes. The physical plane, the abode of the corresponding supra-people in Enroth that create the culture. The Zatomis, the heavenly land of enlightened souls of the people. And the Shrastar, the demonic underworld that counterposes the Zatomis. In addition, every metaculture includes 1 or another number of planes of enlightenment and retribution. The nature of these worlds varies between metacultures in accordance with the course metahistory takes in each. Zatomis, the highest planes of human metacultures, their heavenly lands, the bulwark of the demiurges and national guiding spirits, and the abodes of the synclites. Together with Aramoya, The zatomis of the rows of the world now under construction, they are 34 in number. Shrasters. Vario-dimensional material worlds connected with areas within the physical body of the Earth known as countervailing prominences, which point to the center of the planet. The abode of anti-human kind, which is composed of two races, Igvas and Rarugs. There are great metropolises in the Shrasters and a very advanced demonic technology. Synclites. The hosts of enlightened human souls that abide in the zatomis of metacultures. Aramoya, the zatomis of global culture currently under construction. Rose of the world, the future Christian church of the final centuries, which will reunite within itself the Christian churches of the past, and will be joined on the basis of a free amalgamation with all religions of light. It is in this sense that the rose of the world is interreligious or pan-religious. Its principal task is to save as many human souls as possible and help them avert the danger of being spiritually enslaved by the future anti-God. The birth of the rose of the world among humanity will be a reflection of the ether birth of Sventa Sventana in one of the zatomis. Igvas, the principal race of anti-human kind, it is made up of highly intelligent demonic beings who abide in the Shrasters, the underside of the world. Rarugs, the second race of anti-human kind, into which the great predators of prehistoric times developed after countless incarnations on the planes of demonic materiality. Sventa Sventana, a great god-born monad, an expression of eternal femininity, the bride of the planetary logos. She descended from the heights of the spiritual cosmos to the upper planes of Shadanakar approximately 150 years ago, and is destined to assume an enlightened, and not physical, incarnation in one of the zatomis of humanity. That meta-historical event will be reflected in terrestrial Enroth in the birth of the rose of the world. A great demon, a cohort of Lucifers named Gogtungur, erupted into Shadanakar with legions of lesser demons. The long and fierce battle that ensued ended in a partial victory for him. He was unable to drive the forces of light from the Brahmapura, but he did succeed in creating several demonic planes and turning them into impregnable fortresses. He succeeded in tampering with the emergence and evolution of life on terrestrial Enroth and in leaving his mark on the animal world. The planetary laws that the forces of light were using to create organic life on Enroth were warped beyond recognition. It is wrong and blasphemous to attribute the laws of survival, retribution, and death to the Godhead. For God is light, and in him there is no darkness. From God comes only salvation. From God comes only joy. From God comes only grace. If we are shocked by the cruelty of the world's laws, it is because the voice of God cries out in our soul against the work of the great torturer, the infighting between demonic monads, the victory of the strong over the right, and the expulsion of the vanquished down into the chasm of torment. That law of Lucifer's forces was carved on the face of organic life in Enroth, and took the form of the law of survival. All the suffering that beings experience, all their pain and agony, emit radiations both here, in Enroth, and there, in the worlds of the afterlife. Every feeling, every emotional response necessarily emits corresponding radiations. Radiations from anger, hate, greed, or animal and human lust sink to the demonic planes, replenishing the energy of their various classes and groups of inhabitants. True, those radiations are barely sufficient to replenish the energy of individual demonic groups. But the radiation from suffering and pain, or gavak, is capable of satisfying hosts of demons of almost all types and sizes. Gavak is essentially their food. Gawak, fine material radiations from human suffering released both during one's life and during a descent after death. Gavak replenishes the energy of many categories of demonic beings and of Gogtungur himself. Gogtungur, the name of the planetary demon of our Brahmfatura. He is three persons in one, like certain other beings among the uppermost hierarchies. The first hypostasis of Gogtungur is Gisturg, the great torturer. The second is Fokurma, the great harlot. And the third is Urparp, the great implementer of the demonic plan, who is sometimes called the principle of form. In laying his claws on Shadanakar's laws, Gogtungur warped them in such a way as to generate and increase suffering. He made them onerous, cruel, and unbearable. He resisted the establishment of the law of transformation in Enraf. Death arose as the resultant vector of the two opposing forces and became law. He resisted the principle of universal friendship. The law of survival arose as the resultant vector of the two forces and became a law of life. Finally, the demonic forces tampered with the life of other planes in Shadanakar, those planes through which travel beings who have incarnated at least once on terrestrial Enraf. Those planes were transformed into worlds of retribution, where tormentors reign and imbibe the pain of those who suffer there. Among the various types of Gavak, the one associated with the shedding of physical blood occupies a particularly significant place. When people and animals bleed, a burning radiation of a special intensity is released in the first few minutes. Therefore, certain categories of demons are not so much interested in the death of living beings in Enraf or in the suffering of their souls in the afterlife as they are in bloodshed. Not one bloodbath in history has occurred or will occur without the subliminal instigation of those bloodsuckers of the afterlife. Further, the bloody sacrificial rites of some ancient cultures were horrifying not only because of their cruelty, but also because it was not gods, but those very same demons that were feeding on them. To replenish the power of light, the planetary Logos, as the first and greatest of Shadanakar's monads, created a new plane and laid the foundations for a new humankind. Enraf was left to the animal world. The new plane was populated by Titans, whose external appearance was similar to ours, only larger and more majestic. In a world resembling Enraf, but one still wrapped in twilight, their glowing figures moved against the backdrop of a bluish-gray sky, up the slopes and around the curves of the desert hills they worked on. The Titan humankind numbered a few thousand. They had no gender. The birth of new Titans was in no way connected with the sexual union of two adults. But Gogtungur succeeded in fomenting among them a mutiny against Providence. They were motivated by the idea that they were the seed and nucleus of a new universal power, a third power that opposed both God and the demons. They hungered for absolute freedom, but despised the cruelty and malice of the demons. The mutiny ended with the forces of Gogtungur invoking the law of retribution to draw the Titan souls down to deep plains of torment. Their suffering lasted more than 1,000,000 years, until with the aid of the providential powers, they were able to break out of captivity. The majority of them are now completing their journeys among humanity, standing out from the general mass of people by the magnitude of their genius and its somber, though far from dark, tint. Their creative work is marked by dim recollections of their struggle against God, scorched, as it were, by an ancient fire. It is astonishing in its power. Their spirit differs from demonic monads in its striving for light, its scorn for the base, and its thirst for divine love. I could name a few such people from among the number of giants of world culture: Aeschylus, Dante, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Goethe, Beethoven, Wagner, Ibsen, Lermontov, and Lev Tolstoy. In the last millennium before Christ, the power of Gogtungur was so great that retribution was stripped of its temporality in the afterlife planes of many of humanity's metacultures. All exits from the planes of torment were shut tight, and the sufferer there were deprived of all hope. The law of retribution, the iron law of moral cause and effect, those effects that can manifest themselves in one's present life, but most fully manifest themselves in the afterlife and even in subsequent reincarnations, can be referred to by the Indian term karma. Karma is just as much a result of two opposing wills as are the law of death and the law of survival. If the demonic forces had not encountered continuous resistance from their enemies, the laws would be even harsher, because the demonic purpose of the laws is to generate gavak and paralyze any manifestation of light by the souls that fall afoul of them. The laws have another side, their cleansing nature, a vestige of the ancient proto-laws of light laid down by the great hierarchies that created the world. The goal of those hierarchies, and of all the forces of light in Shadhanakar, was and is the mitigation and enlightenment of the laws. The goal of the demonic forces is their hardening. Providence's design is to save all victims. Gogtungur's design is to turn all into victims. The theo-humankind of the next global era will be a voluntary union in love of all. The Satano-humankind, its rise at the end of the current era appears to be unavoidable, will be an absolute dictatorship of one. The cosmos is the maturing ground of monads. The anti-cosmos is a universal union of rivals and a host of crippled monads of light held captive by them in worlds over which demons rule. The captives have been deprived of the most sacrosanct of their attributes, freedom of choice. Anti-cosmos, provisional designation of all those worlds created by the demonic to supersede the divine cosmos. At present, the anti-cosmos of our Brahmfatura consists of the planes of Shog, Digam, Gasharva, Sufetk, and the Pit. Digm, the abode of Gogtungur, one of the five-dimensional worlds with an abundance of time streams. Gasharva, one of the principal planes in the demonic anti-cosmos of Shadhanakar, a two-dimensional world where a variety of powerful demonic beings abide. Gogtungur is not dismayed by the disparity in magnitude between himself and Lucifer. He, like all demonic monads, sees his comparatively small stature as only temporary. Blind faith in his boundless growth and ultimate victory is an inseparable part of his self. Every one of those monads, no matter how minuscule it may be at present, and no matter what lowly post it may occupy within the rebel hierarchy, believes in like manner in its future macrogalactic triumph. For that reason, all of them, including Gogtungur, are tyrants not only in their dreams and not only at a given moment, but at every stage of their path to the extent permitted by the power they wield at that stage. Tyranny produces a more copious supply of gavak than any other form of rule. The ingestion of gavak increases the energy of demons. If they were to replenish their energy by imbibing other psychic radiations from joy, love, self-sacrifice, religious devotion, ecstasy, or happiness, their essence would be transformed, and they would cease to be demons. But that is exactly what they do not want. Through tyranny and tyranny alone can they bridle the centrifugal forces within the legions of demons subordinate to them. For that very reason, defections from and uprisings against Gogtungur by individual demonic monads sometimes take place in meta-history and are reflected in history. The forces of light cannot come to the aid of such uprisings, since any one of those monads has the potential to become just such a planetary demon. If it proved stronger than Gogtungur, it would become an even worse tormentor than he. One should bear in mind, however, that incidences of uprisings by individual demonic monads, not against Gogtungur as such, but against the demonic world order in general, are not so rare. Such uprisings are nothing other than the conversion of demonic monads to light, and it goes without saying that they are afforded every available means of help from the providential powers. Despite all the satanic cunning of Gogtungur's cosmic designs, those designs are flawed for the reasons given above. The chances that the planetary demon will be able to master all the demonic monads of the universe, and eventually Lucifer himself, are incredibly slim. But his relentless pursuit of dominion over the universe affords him the only joy he can understand. He experiences such joy every time the smallest victory appears to bring him another step closer to the ultimate goal. Those victories consist of his enslavement of other monads or their souls, the demonic monads as half allies, half slaves, and the monads of light as prisoners and objects of torment. As far as Gogtungur can picture the future of the cosmos, he sees himself as a kind of sun around which countless monads orbit, one after another falling into him and being swallowed up, with the entire universe entering into orbit around him and being swallowed up, world, by the monstrously swollen hypermonad. The demonic mind is powerless to picture anything further. The smaller demonic monads are incapable of visualizing even that apotheosis. With unshakable faith in their own ultimate victory over the universe, they focus their will and thoughts on stages that are more immediate and easier to envision. There exists a misconception, a particular mindset held by a large number of people in our time, that has been assiduously inculcated into the minds of many peoples over the last 4 decades. It is a train of thought that leads the thinker to the conclusion, which in time grows into an axiom and dogma, that religion supposedly deprives people of their freedom, demands blind obedience to higher powers, and makes them wholly dependent on those powers. Furthermore, so the thinking goes, since those powers are only figments of the imagination, it is people's dependence on all the very real human institutions that endeavor to exploit the ignorance of the masses that is actually increased. That is the essence of religious slavery, from which humanity is supposedly liberated by science and the philosophy of materialism. To dispute this argument would require writing a tract refuting the basic tenets of materialistic philosophy. Such tracts have already been written, and if they have been insufficiently known in Russia, then the reason for that has more to do with politics than philosophy. As for the claim that all religions demand submission to higher powers, there is no doubt that some religious doctrines have indeed preached predestination and the virtual absence of free will among humans. That is a fact, and I, least of all, am inclined to defend without discrimination any and all religious forms. But to make that charge against religion as a whole is no more justified than to claim, for instance, that literature is essentially reactionary, and to substantiate that claim by citing examples of individual reactionary writers and schools. I would like to explain the fallaciousness of such an accusation in relation to the worldview of the Rose of the World forthwith. First, I would like to voice some puzzlement. No science or philosophy, except subjective idealism, materialism included, disputes the assertion that the human will is dependent on a host of material factors. That very same philosophy of materialism even takes special pains to emphasize the will's heavy dependence on economic factors. Yet, no one is bothered by human subordination to natural and historical necessity. No one expresses outrage at humanity's bondage to the law of gravity, the law of the preservation of matter, the law of evolution, the laws of economic development, and so forth. Everyone understands that there is still enough room for the exercise of our will within the bounds of these laws. The worldview of the rose of the world, however, does not add a single new supplementary factor to the list of factors that determine our will. What is important is their interpretation, not their number. That boundless and endlessly diverse something that is summed up by the phrase, the higher powers, acts on our will not so much through supernatural intrusions as through the medium of those same factors, those same laws of nature, evolution, and so forth, that we have just agreed to regard as objective facts. To a great extent, those sets of factors determine not only our consciousness, but our subconsciousness and superconsciousness as well. They are the origin of the voice of conscience, duty, instinct, and the like, which we hear within ourselves and which determine our behavior in a tangible manner. That is how the link between the higher powers and our will operates. True, there are some phenomena that could at first glance appear to be violations of the laws of nature by the higher powers. They are called miracles. But in cases when such phenomena, as opposed to tricks of the mind, do occur, they are not at all arbitrary violations of natural laws by the higher powers, but the actions of those powers through a number of other laws as yet unknown to us. What frequently appears to us to be the single, monolithic, and indivisible mover of our actions, for example, conscience, is in reality the extremely complex result of the interaction of various factors. Conscience is primarily the voice of our monad. But whether it gains access to our waking consciousness is determined by other factors, for example, some incident that serves as a shock to waken us to the monad's voice, a manifestation of providence, the action of powers of a providential nature. Thus, people's choices are predetermined by three sets of forces: the providential powers, which utilize the laws of nature, and history to achieve their purposes, and which gradually enlighten those laws; the demonic powers, which utilize those same laws and work to strengthen them more and more; and the will of our own monad, transmitted within the range of our consciousness by the voices of our heart and reason with the help of the providential powers. Therefore, whether we view the laws of nature and history as mechanical, lifeless necessities, or as the tools of living, individual variomaterial or spiritual beings, the degree of our freedom will neither decrease nor increase. It follows that the degree of our freedom of choice is no less from the point of view of the rose of the world worldview than it is from the point of view of materialism. But the determining I factors are interpreted differently and are more precisely broken down into their component parts. If the materialist is not bothered by the limitations placed on our freedom by utterly impersonal and lifeless laws of nature, then how can we view as demeaning the limitations placed on our freedom by the will of the providential powers? Only the limitations placed on our freedom by the will of the demonic powers can gall us. It does indeed gall us, but after all, they are those powers, those age-old enemies of ours, the disarming, conversion, and enlightenment of whom is our goal. We will cease to feel galled only when we render ourselves insusceptible to their influence. The evolution of life on Earth raises groups of beings up from a minimal degree of freedom among the simplest forms. The voice of a microbe's monad almost always fails to reach its embryonic consciousness, and its behavior is primarily determined by demonic powers acting on it through the medium of the laws of nature. The higher animals are much freer than a microbe. The amplitude of their conscious action is far greater. In humans, conscious action is increased to an incomparable degree. Opponents of religion as such argue that it demands the renunciation of our individual will and the subordination of that will to God's. In regard to some religions of the past, they are right. But the rose of the world is not a religious teaching of the past. It is a religious and social moral teaching of the future. The rose of the world will not demand submission to the will of God, for only what humans do voluntarily, not under compulsion, is of value. It will not be demands for slavish submission to God's will that will sound from the churches of the some religion. From there will sound forth a call to universal love and free divine co-creation. The divine spirit is our unchanging, inexpressible, and highest yearning. It is the power that creates spirit, that is active in all souls, that is not silenced even in the depths of demonic monads, and that is directing worlds and worlds from micro-brahmphaturas to super-galaxies towards something more perfect than good and something higher than bliss. The higher the stage reached by a monad, the closer its will coincides with the creative will of God. And when, having begun its cosmic journey from the simplest forms of animate matter, it passes through the stages of human being and national, planetary, stellar, and galactic demiurge, it merges, through the agency of God the Son, with God the Father, and its will completely coincides with God's will, its power with God's power, its image with God's image, and its work with the work of God. Divine co-creation is the creative work of the light of all ascending monads of the universe. From humans, elementals, and enlightened animals, to giants of unimaginable grandeur, the galactic demiurges. That is why one sees here so often the word demiurge, a word almost never used in the older religions. Everyone who works for the greater glory of God, out of love for the world and its creator, is a demiurge. God is absolutely good. The old theology also asserted that God is omnipotent. But if God is omnipotent, he is then responsible for the evil and suffering in the world. Therefore, he is not good. It would seem impossible to find a way out of that vicious circle. But God creates of himself. All the monads flowing out of his depths possess as inalienable attributes all the properties of those depths, including absolute freedom. Thus, divine creation itself limits the Creator. It fixes his power at a line beyond which the freedom and power of his creations begin. But freedom is freedom for the very reason that it offers the possibility of different choices. For many monads, it took the form of a negative choice, through their assertion of self only, through their rejection of God. That is the origin of what we call evil in the world, the origin of suffering, the origin of barbaric laws, and therein lies the possibility that evil and suffering can be overcome. The laws protect the world from descending into chaos. The demons, too, are forced to operate within them, if worlds are not to crumble into dust. For that reason, they do not try to overturn laws, but to strengthen them. Laws are blind, and they cannot be enlightened in the blink of an eye, not by a miracle, not by divine intercession. They can be enlightened through the protracted cosmic process whereby monads that have rejected God renounce their evil will. In God, all-embracing love and inexhaustible creativity are blended into one. All living beings, humans included, draw closer to God through the exercise of three divine properties innate to each: freedom, love, and divine co-creation. Divine co-creation is the goal, love is the means, and freedom is the condition. Demonic monads are as free as all monads, but their love is grossly disfigured. It is directed exclusively inward. A demon loves only itself. And since the entire great reservoir of love in its spirit is focused on that single object, a demon loves itself with a degree of intensity no human is capable of achieving. Demonic monads have also not lost their ability to create. But divine co-creation evokes nothing in them but extreme hostility. Every demon creates for its own sake and in its own name only. People's creative work becomes divine co-creation from the moment and to the extent that their irresistible creative impulse is guided by their will and faith, not toward the attainment of one or another egoistic goal: fame, pleasure, riches, the service of a cruel and base teaching, but toward the service of the God of love. Freedom, love, and divine co-creation are the three words that sum up the rose of the world's perspective on art, science, education, marriage, family, nature, and even on those aspects of modern life ignored by all religions: social justice and harmony. Being and consciousness. What I have said supplies us with a new point of view on the centuries-long debate over the primacy of being or consciousness. Consciousness determines being was the formula of the idealistic schools. During the next secular stage of culture, the formula was turned on its head, but its content remained untouched. It was the same juxtaposition of two components, and so the new formula inherited the simplism of its predecessor. The question is much more complex than those formulas. At the same time, it is simpler than the ungainly edifices of premises and conclusions constructed in the 18th and 19th centuries for the extraction of such modest gains. Being determines consciousness. Consciousness determines being. Whose being? Whose consciousness? Of a specific individual? Of humanity? Of the world? Of living, conscious matter? Everything is so jumbled, so imprecise. The consciousness of specific individuals, for simplicity's sake we will speak only of humans, is not determined by any one consciousness or by being in general, but by a set of factors. These factors are: A, the individual's own physical being; B, the being of the individual's natural and cultural environment; C, the consciousness of a large number of people, both living and dead. For by their efforts, these consciousnesses determine, to a significant extent, the cultural milieu in which the individuals live and that affect their being and consciousness. D, the consciousness of X number of other beings who influence the natural environment and transform it. E, the being and consciousness of the hierarchies that create worlds. F, the superconscious individuality inherent in the monad of the individual. G, the being consciousness of the one God, in whom being and consciousness are one, rather than different, conflicting categories. If the question refers not to individuals and their being and consciousness, but to the universe, or to be more exact, the emergence of consciousness in the organic matter of worlds in the universe, then clearly, since the universe is determined by the nature of the one God, the conflict between being and consciousness vanishes, for the above-mentioned reason. Since the universe is determined by the work of God-created monads, the question concerning the emergence of consciousness after some period of unconscious existence becomes irrelevant. For if there were no God-created monads with their consciousness and being, then no matter, neither organic nor inorganic, could come into being either. We could today afford to chuckle over the simplism of the classical formulas if one of them had not become the philosophical dogma of political despotism and caused untold harm, stifling the independent thought of a host of people and barring spirituality from access to their consciousness. The other formula, just as flawed, is nevertheless not as dangerous for the very reason that it is more spiritual. But that does not at all excuse the older religions and their philosophizing, their waste of so many centuries on intellectual speculation, without coming a step closer to understanding the relationship between being and consciousness. The variomaterial composition of humans. Among the numerous planes of Shadanakar, there is a multidimensional world where human monads, indivisible and immortal spiritual entities, the higher selves of humans abide. Created by God and God alone, with some, a very few, mysteriously born of him, they enter Shadanakar, coating themselves in rarefied matter, or rather, energy. This is a substance that permeates all of Shadanakar. Every individual spirit, in entering our Brahmvatura, must coat itself in it. The world where our monads abide is called Iron. Iron, the five-dimensional world where human monads abide. Creative work toward the eventual enlightenment of the universe is the task of every monad, except demonic ones. There are no demonic human monads. Human monads carry out that enlightening work in lower worlds assigned to them, creating material coatings for themselves there and acting on the environment of those planes by means of the coatings. The monad first creates a shelt from five-dimensional materiality, then an astral body from four-dimensional materiality. We often group these two coatings together under the word soul. A shelt is the material vessel of the monad, with all its divine properties and capacities. It is not the monad, which remains in five-dimensional iron, but the shelt that begins the journey on the lower planes. The shelt is created by the monad alone. Mother Earth, the great elemental, takes part in the creation of the astral body. She takes part in the creation of astral bodies for all beings of Shadanakar: humans, angels, demons, animals, elementals, demons, and even the great hierarchies, when the latter descend to planes where an astral body is required. The astral body is the higher instrument of the shelt. Concentrated within it are the gifts of spiritual sight, spiritual hearing, spiritual smell, deep memory, the ability to levitate, to communicate with the synclites, demons, elementals, and angels, and to perceive cosmic panoramas and perspectives. Elementals, a category of God-created monads that proceed along a path of growth in Shadanakar, primarily through the realms of nature. In the majority of cases, however, they do not undergo physical incarnation. Since humanity is an aspect of one realm of nature, there are various groups of elementals linked not to the natural elements, in the broad sense of the word, but to the natural elemental aspect of humanity. Astral body, the second of the subtle material coatings of a monad. The shelt, the first of the subtle material coatings, is fashioned by the monad itself. The great elemental Mother Earth takes part in the creation of the astral body. She takes part in the creation of the individual astral bodies of every being in Shadanakar. Humans, angels, demons, animals, elementals, demons, and even the great hierarchies. When the latter descend to planes where an astral body is required, the astral body is the higher instrument of the shelt. Concentrated within it are the gifts of spiritual vision, spiritual hearing, spiritual smell, deep memory, the ability to levitate, the ability to interact with beings of other planes, and the ability to contemplate cosmic panoramas and perspectives. Shelt, the first of the material coatings of a monad. The shelt is fashioned by the monad itself from five-dimensional materiality. It is the vessel of the monad together with its divine properties and capacities. It is not the monad, which remains in Eirolen, but the Shelt that is the self that embarks on its journey through the lower planes in order to enlighten them. Mother Earth, fertilized by the spirit of the sun, next creates an ether body for the incarnating monad. No life in 3- and 4-dimensional worlds is possible without it. When the Shelt with all its coatings, including the ether body, abandons the physical body, the last, outermost, and shortest-lived of its vessels, nothing but a corpse remains in Enroth. Our physical body is created for us by the angelic hierarchies. They create the matter. And by Lilith, the great elemental of humanity, who forges the family chain from 3-dimensional materiality. The monad itself, through the Shelt, contributes to the process by bestowing individuality on a given link in the chain, Lilith. The great elemental of humanity, at one time the spouse of the prime angel, and later the fashioner of the physical flesh of humans and some other beings. Her own being was demonized by Gugtungur long before the emergence of humanity in Enroth. Once the process of descent has concluded, the process of ascent begins. A monad can assume a physical body either just one time or over and over again. An ether body is created anew only if the bearer, in falling afoul of the law of retribution, is forced to embark on a journey through the great plains of torment. As for the path of ascent, the ether body accompanies the bearer through all the worlds of enlightenment, all the way up to the Zatomis and the abodes of enlightened humankind, the celestial cities of the metacultures. The ether body is composed of a living substance that is not everywhere uniform. Differing as it does in all 3- and 4-dimensional worlds, it would be proper to call it, in recalling the ancient revelation given to humanity, Arungvilta Prana. The astral body accompanies the bearer higher, up to and including the Sakwala of higher purpose. Higher than that, only the Shelt is left to achieve final enlightenment and merge with the monad. Then the monad departs from Eirolen and, coated with an extremely rarefied Shelt, rises up the stairway to the highest worlds of Shatanakar. All these planes will be discussed in later parts of the book. Many of them will be described in as much detail as possible. But I am, unfortunately, incapable of throwing more light on the interaction between the various coatings of the monad and on their functions and structure. Metacultures. The structure of Shatanakar, a vast area of investigation that we shall soon enter, will remain unintelligible at the most basic of levels if the meaning of the words supra-people, metaculture, and transmyth is not firmly grasped beforehand. The term supra-people refers to a group of nations united by a common, jointly created culture, or to an individual nation, if that nation alone has created a culture that has reached a high level of distinction and maturity. It goes without saying that completely isolated cultures do not exist. Cultures interact with each other. But on the whole, each culture is entirely unique and, despite the influence it exerts on other cultures, it remains, in all its fullness, the achievement of only one supra-people, which is its creator. It would not be necessary to introduce the supra-people concept if it did not possess meta-historical as well as historical significance. Its meta-historical significance rests in the fact that the distinctiveness of a supra-people is not limited to its own cultural sphere of influence in Enroth, but also affects many variomaterial planes, both of ascent and descent. For certain parts of those planes are subject to the activities of one supra-people alone. One should bear in mind that the term supra-people not only includes those individuals, our contemporaries, who belong to it now. a great many of those who belonged to it earlier, even at the very dawn of its history, and who afterward, in the afterlife, have acted and act now on transphysical planes linked to that superpeople. A staircase of planes common to all superpeoples rises above humanity. But the complexion, landscape, and function of each plane varies above each superpeople. There are even planes that only exist above a single superpeople. The exact same is true of the demonic worlds of descent, which exist, as it were, beneath superpeoples. Thus, a significant portion of Shadanakash consists of individual multiplane segments. In each of those segments, the Enlightens plane is occupied by only one superpeople and its culture. Those multiplane segments of Shadanakar are called metacultures. Every superpeople has its own myth, which does not take shape in the culture's infant stage alone. Since the traditional use of the word myth does not match the meaning attached to it here, it is necessary to explain carefully in what sense I use the word. When we speak of a tightly integrated system of rich symbols that embody some comprehensive international teaching, and that find expression in legends and ritual, in theology and philosophy, in monuments of literature and art, and lastly, in a moral code, we are speaking of myths of the great international religions. There are 4 such myths: Hindu, Buddhist, Christian, and Muslim. When we speak of a tightly integrated system of rich symbols that define the relationship of one superpeople to Enlightens and to the transphysical and spiritual worlds, a system molded into a definite religion that has played an enormously significant role in the history of the given suprapeople, but has rarely spread beyond its boundaries, we are speaking of national religious myths of individual suprapeoples. Such are the Egyptian, ancient Iranian, Jewish, Germanic, Gallic, Aztec, Incan, Japanese, and some other myths. When we are referring to symbols just as rich, and perhaps also tied, although not as closely, to ideas of a religious and moral nature, which, though they have not evolved into a strictly formulated system, reflect nonetheless a group of common moral, transphysical, meta-historical, or cosmic truths in connection with the specific nature and role of that culture. We are dealing with shared myths of superpeoples. Such are the myths of the Southwestern Roman Catholic superpeople, the Northwestern Germanic Protestant superpeople, or the Russian superpeople. In some cultures, the Greco-Roman or Babylonian Canaanite, for example, their myths had already passed the shared stage of development, but did not take shape in a system strictly formulated enough to allow the Olympic or Babylonian myths to be numbered among the national religious myths of superpeoples. Last is the 4th and final group shared national myths. They are myths of individual ethnic groups within a superpeople that have created, as a supplement to the shared superpeople myth, their own particular, very restricted variations of that myth, variations that have not evolved into any strictly formulated system or religion. One could cite as examples the pagan myths of the Slavic tribes, the Finnish tribes, the Turkish tribes, as well as the myths of some isolated and primal tribes in India. Ethnic myths in their embryonic state can be observed among many ethnic groups, but they rarely achieve any clear expression. We will not use the word myth in reference to any other phenomenon in the history of culture. The last 3 groups of myths are concerned with one specific culture. The first group, the myths of international religions, are, with one exception, mystically linked to planes in Shadanakar above those segmented sections called metacultures. It seems to me that the concept of national religious myths can be grasped without too much difficulty. As for the shared myths of suprapeoples, for the sake of clarity, a pair of supplementary definitions are in order. Defined inductively, the shared myth of a suprapeople is the sum of its beliefs concerning the trans-physical cosmos and the part the given culture and each self belonging to that culture play within it. The very concept, given culture, can be no more precisely formulated than it was, for example, by the Greco-Romans, who distinguished between themselves and the rest of humanity, whom they lumped together as barbarians. The culture elaborates these beliefs, molding them into cycles of religious philosophical ideas, iconography, social moral systems, state political institutions, and cycles of national lifestyle manifested in ritual, daily routines, and tradition. Defined deductively, the shared myth of a suprapeople is an awakening by the suprapeople, in the person of its most creative representatives, to a second reality above them, of which the suprapeople is a part, and in which the direction of its growth and the roots of its fate are hidden. This awakening is made groggy by additives foreign to it issuing from unattuned human nature. We can give that second reality, which serves as the object of transphysical, metahistorical, artistic, and philosophical apprehensions, the provisional name of transmyth. It goes without saying that the discrepancy between myth and transmyth can vary considerably. The limitations of those who apprehended the transmyth through intuition, dreams, artistic inspiration, religious meditation, or meta-historical enlightenment. The national, temporal, class, and individual peculiarities of their conscious and subconscious minds, the latter playing an active part in the process. The impossibility of finding words or three-dimensional images to convey precisely the reality of variodimensional worlds can not all that lead to countless aberrations, to the cluttering of the myth with a mass of chance, inaccurate, anthropomorphic, simplistic, and even simply wrong ideas. But myths are dynamic. They exist in time, evolving and changing in appearance, and their later phases, as a rule, approach more closely the transmyth, because the minds that apprehend it have over the centuries become subtler, richer, keener, and broader. But in the meantime, the transmyth is also evolving. The reality behind our reality is seething with movement, and there can be no question of it remaining static. The landscapes, edifices, and activities within a transmyth at the time of its emergence differ from those at the end of its metahistorical development as much as the city fortresses of the Merovingians differ from modern-day Paris. But two different realities, two different planes, two poles of the metacultural globe exist at every stage of the transmyth development, together with the people on Enroth who apprehend it. There are also other planes around those planes and between them, but each of them either appeared at a later time or has undergone radical changes. Some have even disappeared. Only three realms are stable and enduring. First, the suprapeople in Enroth. Second, the abode of its enlightened souls. The holy cities and celestial land of its metaculture in the variodimensional space above them. And third, down below, in the worlds of descent, the antipode of the heavenly land. A bastion erected in worlds bound to strata deep within the planet's physical body. It is the focal point of the demonic in the given metaculture. The heavenly lands and everything contained within them are called zatamis. The subterranean bastions are called shrasters. Of these two poles, it is the zatomis that are usually reflected in a more detailed and distinct manner in myths. The images of shrasters often do not take a finished form. As for the zatomis, the abode of the synclites of metacultures, they can be found in the myths of every suprapeople, in both religious and shared myths. Such is Eanna of the Babylonians. The ziggurat in the city of Erech was, in the view of the Sumero-Akkadians, a model of the mountain of the gods, heavenly Eanna. Later, the Babylonians saw an analogous meaning in the chief religious edifice of their great city, the seven-storied temple of Esagila. Such is Olympus of the Greeks and Romans. Such is Sumera, or Mount Meru, of the Indians, the Indian Olympus, on the slopes of which glitter the celestial cities of Hindu gods. Such are the images of paradise and Eden in the Byzantine and Roman Catholic metacultures, Jannat in the Arab Muslim metaculture, Shangti in the Chinese metaculture, Montsalvat in the Northwestern metaculture, and Kitezh in the Russian metaculture. As we attempt to descry the heavenly land of the Northwestern metaculture through the thick haze of art, religion, mythology, and social systems, we should always bear in mind that suprapeoples, while they exist in Enraf, never cease creating their myths. The forms of expression change. New groups of people enter the historical scene as depictors of the myths. From the anonymous creators of folklore and customs, the task of myth-building passes to thinkers and artists whose names are washed by waves of national love. But the myth lives on. It lives on, deepening, injected with new content, revealing new meaning in old symbols and introducing new symbols, in accordance with a higher level of overall cultural development of those apprehending it, and secondly, with the continuing metahistorical growth of the transmyth itself. The heavenly land of the Northwestern culture appears to us as Montsalvat, an eternally illuminated mountaintop where, through the centuries, righteous knights have guarded the Holy Grail, which contains the blood of the Logos incarnate that Joseph of Arimathea collected at the crucifixion and which was committed to the charge of the pilgrim Titurel, the founder of Montsalvat. In the distance towers an eerie castle built by the sorcerer Klingzor. This is the focal point of the forces that reject God and strive with dogged resolve to crush the power of the Montsalvat community, the keepers of the greatest of the holy relics and mysteries. These are the two poles of the shared myth of the Northwestern suprapeople, which came down from the anonymous composers of old Celtic legends through Wolfram von Eschenbach and down to Richard Wagner. The claim that Wagner's Parsifal is the last word on the myth is far from indisputable and surely premature. The Montsalvat transmyth is evolving. It is becoming ever more magnificent. We can only hope that thinkers and poets whose metahistorical enlightenment will allow them to apprehend and depict the heavenly land of Montsalvat as it is today will yet emerge from among the peoples of the Northwest. Montsalvat, the Zatumis of the Northwestern metaculture. It is easy to see that the majority of even the greatest human images in the Northwestern myth do not and cannot have a direct connection to the image of Montsalvat. To expect a direct connection in every case would be to reveal a narrow and formalistic approach to the question, even a complete failure to grasp what a shared myth of a suprapeople, not a national religious myth, is. Basically, every human image created by a great writer, artist, or composer, an image that continues to live on in the conscious and subconscious minds of millions of people, and has become the inner acquisition of all who creatively perceive the image. Every such image is a mythical image. Kriemhild and Ophelia, Macbeth and Brant, Rembrandt's Esther and Goethe's Margaret, Egmont and Mr. Pickwick, Jean-Christophe and Jolyon Forsyte are mythical to the same degree as Lohengrin and Parsifal. But what is the connection between the iconography, as well as the philosophical and social ideas, of the Northwestern culture and the poles of the Northwestern myth Montsalvat and Klingzor's castle? The poles of every suprapeople myth are ringed by a large number of circles, by whole worlds of images whose connection with the myth's focal point springs from their inner affinity with it, not from the role they play in the particular story, and from our ability to interpret and apprehend them through meta-historical contemplation within, or next to, the center of the myth. Faust, of course, is not Merlin. Byron's Cain is not Klingzor. Peer Gynt is not Amfortas, and it would be strange indeed, at first glance, to compare Hauptmann's Immanuel Quint with Parsifal. The image of Kundry, so central to the myth, has not been given equal treatment anywhere on the myth's outskirts. On the other hand, we will not find any prototypes of Hamlet or King Lear, of Margaret or Solveig within the center of the Northwestern myth. But their gaze is directed toward it. One can make out a reddish glow on their clothing, a reflection of either the Holy Grail or the sorcerous fires of Klingzor. These colossal figures, rising up from various stages of artistic realism, at various stages of mystic illumination, resemble sculptures that guard the approach up the landings of the stairway to the sanctuary, where the greatest mystery of the Northwestern peoples is kept, the holy relic that sends out spiritual waves of providence and grace to countries wrapped in thickening gloom. Do we really discern the glow from the light of the holy relic, or from the light of the other pole of the myth? The satanic castle of Klingzor on the legends of the Knights of the Round Table alone? Or on the Bayreuth operas alone? If Montsalvat ceased to be for us a mere poetic image among images, just an enchanting tale or musical melody, and assumed its true significance, the significance of a higher reality, we would discern its glow on the Gothic abbeys and Baroque architecture, on the canvases of Ruisdael and Dürer, in the landscapes of the Rhine and Danube, Bohemia and Bretagne, in the stained glass windows behind church altars, and in the austere liturgy and ritual of Lutheranism. The glow would be visible to us as well in the sanitized, soulless palace grounds of the Sun King, and in the skylines of cities rising across the ocean like a palmyre of skyscrapers. We would see it in the lyrical poems of the Romantics and in the works of the great playwrights, in Masonry and Jacobism, in the systems of Fichte and Hegel, even in the doctrines of Saint-Simon and Fourier. It would require a separate volume to illustrate how the power of contemporary science, the wonders of technology, and the ideas of socialism, even communism on the one hand, and Nazism on the other, are contained within the myth of Montsalvat and Klingzor's castle. Nothing, no modern scientific discoveries, including the splitting of the atom, takes Northwestern humanity outside the limits circumscribed by the prophetic symbolism of its myth. I imagine that other interconnections, as yet undisclosed, will reveal themselves to those who read through this book. I have touched on one of the metacultures with its myth and transmyth only to help readers comprehend in a concrete manner the concept of the heavenly lands of humankind, located on enlightened planes at the summits of the respective metacultures, and to help them grasp the significance of their antipodes. The bastions of the powers that reject God, that are actively engaged in constructing their anti-cosmos and in struggling with the forces of light within all the supra-peoples of Enroth, on every plane and in every metacultural region. But the stairway of planes in Shadanakar does not end where the segments of metacultures reach their zenith. Above them rise 5- and 6-dimensional worlds, which have also been reflected, though hazily, in the religions and myths of humanity. The title transmyth is also used in that sense in reference to many of these planes. But the word transmyth is used in a narrower and higher sense in reference to one Sakwala in particular. A system of 5-dimensional worlds with an immense number of time streams. It consists of 5 magnificent, wondrous, translucent pyramids, which seem to glow with an inner light and which tower imposingly over Enroth. From there, not only Enroth, but the heavenly lands of the metacultures too, seem to be shrouded in murk far below. Those worlds are the highest aspects of 3, not 4, great international religions, and of 2 religions that have, for a number of historical reasons, almost never broken out of their national confines, but that are illuminated by the glow from both their Zatumis and that incomparably higher Sakwala. More will be said about that Sakwala in one of the later chapters. I would also like to mention something as an aside. I imagine that many readers of this book are wondering why all the new words and names used to refer to the lands of the transphysical world and the plains of Shadanakar, even the names of almost all the hierarchies, do not sound Russian. That is because the Russian metaculture is one of the youngest. By the time its synelite had begun to form, everything had already been named by others. One most often hears in these words sounds suggestive of Sanskrit, Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and Arabic, and sometimes even more ancient tongues of which no philologist, as yet, has any inkling. I don't know them either, of course. I have based my judgments concerning their strange phonetic construction only on individual words. It now seems to me that everything necessary has been said to allow subsequent parts of the book to be fully intelligible. We have before us 4 parts almost wholly devoted to a description of the structure of Shadanakar, a kind of transphysical geography. Only by gaining an understanding, if only approximate, of the theater of and participants in the metahistorical drama can we proceed to those parts that are devoted to the metahistorical processes themselves, in particular, the metahistory of Russia and its culture, as well as the metahistory of modern times. This is connected with the tasks and concrete program of the Rose of the World, and with an account of those historical paths that make possible the bloodless unification of humanity, global prosperity, the ennobling education of younger generations, and the transformation of the planet into a garden, and the global state into a family. From there, a bridge will be built to the final chapters, to certain distant historical prognoses, to the problem of the final catastrophe of global history, and to the inevitable, cataclysmic passage of Enroth to a higher material, a different plane of existence. The last few pages are devoted to the cosmic panorama that will unfold when that happens. Thank you for listening. Why not to subscribe for more?